This is the first episode of Mari seminars this year, and as you can see, we partnered with Microsoft AI for Good Lab, and the two labs will be joining hands to host seminar series going forward. So today we are pleased to have Simone and Akram. The two will be presenting on strategic subset selection in satellite imagery, insights from the machine vision for Earth observation challenge. I'll take a moment to introduce them. Akram is, Dr. Akram is a senior applied scientist at Microsoft's AI for Good Lab, specializing in geospatial machine learning. He partnered with NGOs to apply AI in resolving pressing environmental issues such as wildlife conflicts, extreme weather quantification, impact mapping, and climate change. Before joining Microsoft, Akram completed his postdoctoral research at IBM Research, where he focused on geospatial machine learning and applied research. Akram has a strong interest in geospatial machine learning, deep neural networks, foundation models, and self or weekly supervised learning. Dr. Simone Fobi is an applied research scientist too in the Microsoft AI for Good Lab as well. Her work leverages computer vision, remote sensing, and machine learning to address societal problems in climate change, food security, and humanitarian crisis. Prior to joining Microsoft, she completed her PhD from Columbia University under the guidance of Professor Vijay Modi and Professor J. Tenaja. Her research interests include self-supervised learning, transfer learning, and domain adaptation approaches that support local differentiation and developing deep learning methods for low data regime. So I'll take it, please take it away, Simone. I'll just stop sharing and we'll give you a moment to share your screen and you can just get started.
Sounds good. Can everyone see my screen okay?
I can see your screen. I can see your screen pretty well. Thank you.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I was just about to say good morning, but then it's not morning everywhere. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss our participation in the data-centric land cover classification challenge. This work was done by Akram, who is going to be presenting the second half today, myself, and a few of our other colleagues, Caleb and Anthony. So I just want to take a minute to acknowledge them. So let's get into it. Currently, there's a diversity of satellite products out there at varying spatial resolutions, varying temporal cadences, all of them being acquired and made accessible to people who are interested in using them. However, corresponding labels to go with the volume of imagery out there is more difficult to obtain. And while these, especially when you consider the different applications that the imagery might be used for, so it becomes very hard to utilize this imagery by acquiring labels exhaustively. So we need to start thinking about how we can determine how best we label or which samples are the most advantageous samples to use to train a model when you cannot exhaustively label or have a labeling budget. So with that in mind, that's sort of how we approach this challenge. And before we actually go into what we did, it's worthwhile thinking about a specific, maybe downstream application of where a data-centric approach might be valuable. So the AI for Good Lab has done quite some work on building damage assessment post a natural disaster. And a few insights come out from that exercise. One of it being that having good model performance is essential, but also doing it for rapid response is of equal importance so that you can have actionable steps when the disaster occurs. In this particular case, you can imagine that on the left, we have a large extent where a disaster may have occurred. And one question that comes to mind, given the time constraints that you might have and your desire to have a high-performing model is, which of the patches in this landscape should you label? And probably even more, zooming in a bit more, is which samples say of buildings, of backgrounds here would be most advantageous to train a model to do well over this extent. So this particular application and a few others actually served as motivation to engage in this challenge, to start to uncover or unpeel how we might go about consciously acquiring labels for any given task. So to go into the challenge itself, like I mentioned, the general motivation is how do we efficiently select where to label, or how do we determine which samples might be valuable when you are limited in resources? This could be number of people labeling, this could be the cost to label, this could be time, whatever resources of value to you. And our goal here, and the goal of the challenge also, was to come up with a way to prioritize samples, and these samples will be validated in some downstream approach. So specifically, if you had a set of n samples, we want to be able to rank those samples from 0 to 1, 1 being most valuable, 0 being least valuable. And given the ranking strategy that, or ranking scores that you've assigned to the samples, these samples will be used to train downstream models for evaluation. Specifically in the evaluation setup, it's not just looking at a specific sample size. Once you've come up with your scores for each sample, different sample sizes are taken given your top 1% or top 10%, top 25%, and downstream models are trained to do semantic segmentation, and then the scores are averaged over the varying sample sizes and on a test set, and that's what is used to evaluate how well your ranking strategy performed. For the data set used in this competition, it was actually the 2022, data fusion contest data set, which consisted of three groupings or three categories of data. One was auto-rectified imagery at, I believe, 50 cm per pixel. We were also provided with digital elevation model data at about 100 cm per pixel. And then we had labels, land classification labels, 16 classes, though in effect more closer to 14 because two of the labels or classes were not necessarily present in that data set. So given the overarching data set, it was split into a train set and validation and a held out test set, which we didn't have visibility to. It was just the organizers that had visibility into the test set, and they used that to generate the leaderboard metrics. So being provided with that train set, our task then, or we're then tasked to score these train samples, assign a score to each of them, return them to the organizers who would validate the performance of our scoring. But we couldn't just rank the samples and returning to them, we also had to come up with a way to verify internally that our ranking approaches were correct, or and understand also how they were performing in general, besides just being correct. So to do that, we had an internal experimentation set up. What that meant is we had to create an internal test set, which meant we split the computation validation set into a validation, internal validation, and internal test set, which would just be used to evaluate the metrics or evaluate the scored samples later. We also did some data cleaning, which was removing samples that either had no data or had cloud coverage, as there was little value to those samples when ranking them, and by consequence, training a model on them. For our training setup, we emphasized the lower sample sizes just to speed up the iteration process. But once we understood, or once we started to understand the sensitivity of varying knobs, then we would include the larger sample size. To control for uncertainty, we ran our experiments multiple times and computing standard deviation and selecting approaches that were a bit more stable in performance across multiple runs. And then the other thing was we mirrored the metrics used by or provided by the organizers, just to make sure that we weren't doing anything differently, and we could really match up with how they were going to evaluate our process. And then after we did that setup, it was a matter of developing the varying scoring functions, looking at results, understanding why one scoring function performed better than the other. So again, to clarify, we more or less just mimicked what the organizers were doing, but created an internal test set where we used to validate the scores we gave the train samples. Okay, so the crux of the work is really around the scoring functions that we were looking at. And we explored roughly 3 sets of methods. One of them was an image-based methods that only looked at images regardless of their corresponding mask, and said if we only looked at the images, could we come up with a way of determining which image patches are more valuable than other patches. The other methods looked at mask-based approaches. Here, we focused on the single channel label mask that was paired with the RGB and DEM images that we had, and said, could we identify high quality masks that could help with efficiently learning how to do the segmentation task. And then naturally, as a third bucket or third grouping, we considered hybrid methods combining the image and mask-based scoring approaches. So in this next section, it's mainly going to be a discussion of what we explored and what we submitted, and then we'll discuss later how those performed. So the first thing that we looked at from the image-based methods was what we labeled as a Venn clustering approach. And this was mainly based on utilizing the Venn score. And the Venn score is actually inspired by ecological diversity, where diversity is quantified as the effective number of species in a population. And how it is measured is taking the exponential of the entropy of the distribution of species in that population. So from a practical standpoint, how we utilize the Venn score is we start off with just looking at the image patches, extracting their features, be it through a transformer or ResNet encoder pre-trained on a given model or a given set of images, rather. Once we extract those features, we apply some clustering, in this case, k-means clustering, and we have an initial set of clusters. We then compute the mean Venn score across the clusters with the assumption that as you cluster and get better clusters, your Venn score within the cluster within uniform clusters should decrease. So we calculate the mean Venn score for the current cluster and determine how much the Venn score has changed relative to a previous iteration and a threshold. And we continue this clustering process until the score stabilizes or settles and we don't see much change. And then we determine that these are interesting clusters, each separate but uniform within the cluster that we can sample from. We then sample from each cluster, and having sample from each cluster, we assign a ranking score to each sample and do this over the set of training samples. So visually, this is an example of what the clusters look like when we apply this clustering approach with the Venn score. We see that when we put the RGB images alongside the mask, we're getting distinctive masks across each cluster, which is a desirable thing that we want, and then we can sample from each cluster and assign scores for ranking. Okay. The second approach is a combination of two approaches. One is what we call a pseudo-clustering approach that still tries to mimic or maximize diversity across all the clusters. And then we do apply an entropy sampling approach. So the pseudo-clustering approach is quite simple. We compute the L2 norm of the image representations. And once we have that norm, we sample across percentile bins. And on the right, we show an example of what those clusters look like for the images and the corresponding masks. And this is a softer way of doing it, mainly to bypass some of the potential drawbacks that might exist with k-means, say an equal or near equal assignment in each cluster. So once we have this pseudo clustering method and have sampled across percentile bins, we also have concurrently a model that is trained with a small set of samples, and then given the predictions from that model, the probabilities from that model, we can use that to compute a patch-wise entropy. And the assumption here is that samples that have higher entropy are an indication that there's more uncertainty, and maybe those samples or more model uncertainty, and maybe those samples are more valuable for training. So once we compute patch-wise entropy, we use that to rank all the samples, and then we average both approaches to come up with a final score. I think I will stop here from now, and Akram will hop in if that's okay.
Thanks, Simon. Give me 1 minute. I'll share my screen. Can you confirm you see the slide?
Yes, it looks good.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, so the first set of methods or submissions that we tried while participating in the competition really were focused on the idea of clustering and only using the inputs. So these are the image patches, the square image patches, and we try to make use of this idea of diversity. So we want to select as diverse images as possible and balance, and that's why we use the clustering method. This second half would focus more on the idea of label quality. So as we know with the semantic segmentation, you have an image and you have these masks or labels that have the same dimension as the image, as you see on the right side, right? So you have the original image and you have some classes for each pixel. Now, what we wanted to do with submission 3 is to assess the quality or the value of a sample by how complex the label is, or how complex the annotation by the user is, right? So we needed a measure, or we needed the scoring function that would take in the mask or the label. It wouldn't actually make use in this case of the image. It would just take the labels and give us a score that again tries to estimate how complex the label is. The hypothesis being is that if the label is more complex, it would contain more information. So these are higher quality samples if they come with complex labels. So we tried two methods with this. The first one is the one you see on the middle column. So that's the idea of class entropy. And the way it works is that it takes the labels. Let's say a patch, it has a set of class or pixel classes, and it would calculate the ratio of each class present in that patch or in that label patch. And through that, through these ratios, we can calculate the overall entropy that exists within the label. In this case, what we mean is that if we have high entropy, then there are many classes, there are many categories or features within the patch. And the opposite is also true. If the entropy is low, that means that like the image is quite easy to annotate. There aren't many classes inside of it. Maybe it's just forest or sea, and that's it, just one class. So we clearly here favoring the idea of having more classes within a single data point. So that's the first idea, is to turn the labels into this vector of ratios and then use that to calculate entropy. The second one focuses more on the edges, the presence of edges. And that is the method that we used called local binary pattern, where we for each pixel, we compare the value of that pixel to its neighbors and encode that as binary, and through that we can again calculate entropy. But in that case, entropy being high means there are many edges. Again, the goal here is to assess complexity through edge detection. So more edges means the label is more complex, and more complex means it's more valuable. And that is how we rank, right? We rank by complexity of the label, either through entropy or local binary pattern. We do it that way. An added detail about this that I think Simon already mentioned is that we don't strictly rank by the score. We just use these scores, these entropy scores, to create a probability sampling distribution. And so we can add some randomness. So we're not really overly biased to just use the most complex, but we add a few more uniform labels. So this is what you'd get using this algorithm. So this is like the top 100 selected data points using mask complexity or label complexity. As you see on the far left, you have first column is just a set of sample images, and then right to the right side, their associated masks or labels, right? And the way we rank again is by first calculating the entropy for each label, and then using that to sample in favor of more complex data points. So we also figured out something that has to do with the effectiveness of these methods when it comes to low labeling budgets versus high labeling budgets. So what we noticed is that in the low label regime, where you just like working, let's say, with 500, you only can use 500 data points for your training pipeline. In these regimes, diversity works better. So actually favoring complexity doesn't really work. We need an initial seeding data set that has more uniform patches, but then later on, the mass complexity takes over as the favorite one, as the one that gives you the most edge. So in submission 4, which is the last submission we tried, we wanted to create a hybrid between the two. We used Venn clustering to focus on diversity early on, but then after budget goes beyond 700 patches, we use explicitly mask complexity ranking, the way I described before, by favoring labels that are more complex. So yeah, we got the chance to submit 4 times these 4 submissions, and these are the results. So the figure on the x-axis, you have our internal scores, because as Simon mentioned, we didn't have access to the test data set provided by the organizers. So we had to create something similar internally to evaluate our own methods before submitting. And then on the y-axis, we have the leaderboard scores, right? And these are the ones published by the competition organizers. Colored, the lines just mean the 4 submissions. So we go Venn, diversity, and then the 2 entropy-based label complexity functions we tried. The numbers on the line just means the different subsets. So our subsets were like 770 and then 7,700 and 19,000. So we actually tested our scoring functions on 3 budgets for training. And we can notice a loose correlation between our internal scores and the leaderboard scores. It's not really perfect correlation, and we didn't expect that. It's just like was a good indication that we were making progress. Overall, submission number 3, mask entropy, was the best one. So from the leaderboard perspective, from the competition, and they really highlighted that like the focus on label quality should be priority when it comes to constructing training data sets. Some insights that we got from the competition, and maybe as future work too, is that like our simple hybridization methods did not really yield superior performance. So just simply using a sampling, a scoring function in one regime and then switching to the other didn't really work. Maybe something that like combines probability functions from both methods and kind of smoothen the sampling space would be better here. But it didn't work in the case that I was mentioned for submission 4. As I mentioned, right, like the move to probabilistic sampling versus explicit ranking was beneficial, and we want to experiment more with that. And again, like the overall insight was that labels were useful. However, in many setups, we don't have access to the labels. Actually, the motivation would be to find an algorithm to tell you where to label. So although in this competition we had access to labels, we treated that as an investigation into the real benefits of complex labels. In a realistic setup, we don't have labels, and maybe we'd use more proxy models or some kind of complexity measure that only uses the images or the inputs and not really the labels. So we tried other things, right? What we showed here are just the methods that we ended up submitting. And it's worth highlighting a few things that did not work, did not really improve performance, although we expected we were more helpful. The first one is active learning. Now, active learning is to be brief, is just uses like some kind of model feedback to know where to label or where to go when it comes to annotation. So we tried many techniques that fall under active learning, and they didn't really help us. We tried clustering first, and then within the clusters, we do some kind of ranking, like, for example, doing label-based ranking inside each cluster as a way of hybridizing both categories. That also didn't work. We tried filtering low effort labels, and although that should work, but I think that it didn't because the other submissions were already doing that. So we have methods that overlap each other. And that's the same case with the variance encoder augmentation, which is like this observation that like our data set is not really the original one, but it is the data set plus every possible augmentation of every patch, because the training pipeline used rotation and flipping augmentation on these data points. So that also didn't work, although it was interesting. I think for the same reason. What we found interesting to study is like the difference between low regimes and high regimes. What does it take for us to excel or to achieve optimal results when we only start with 100 labels or with 500? And what makes the difference later on, right? And why also? And also when it comes to semantic segmentation with noisy labels, which is the case here, there are standards that are used in industry, such as like semi-supervised learning, making heavy use of augmentation and so on, that we really want to do an ablation study and like try to figure out how much they contribute to downstream performance versus using a bare neural net for training. Yeah, this is going a bit into one insight that is actually applicable to most data sets for labels. When we humans like annotate satellite imagery, we tend to miss a lot of detail. It would depend on the environment and like how much time you have and so on. That is actually what introduces the noise into the masks, right? And we noticed that, and then we said, how about like we train a proxy model, a model that is actually capable of noticing the detail, then using it to assess the effort, right, put by a human when annotating. And that is interesting, and that's what you see on these figures there. Like you have, for example, on the right side, you have an image, you have its corresponding label or mask in the middle, and then you have the predictions by the model. Now, the predictions, although they are noisy, they capture more detail than the labels. The labels are very low effort, right? So using some proxy model in an active learning way, where you have like a seed of points you can train on, and then use that model to assess the effort on all of the other patches and filter out what patches are low effort, and then put emphasis on the ones that are actually outperforming in complexity your proxy model would be quite interesting here. Yeah, a link like a similar observation can be made about like augmentation and its usefulness for downstream training. In this domain where we have like these patches and we want to train, we usually use augmentation, color jitter, flipping, rotation, and so on. And like The idea here being that like when you flip a patch, you're gonna get a different neural representation, right? And that's like, you can even consider it a whole new data point added to your data set. So, okay, like, can we quantify the points by how much variance they add, how much novelty they add when you augment them, when you change them? So we found this direction interesting. However, if you just do high variance versus low variance, the low variance points are very like uniform and non-informative, that they were actually filtered out by the earlier methods. So incorporating this strategy wasn't really that useful. However, I was still interested in like studying the full continuous spectrum and not just the extremes. So yeah, summarizing quickly, future directions, we want to dig deeper into the assessing complexity without labels. So in this one, we had access to labels, so we did that. But then how can you assess the potential complexity of a label just using the images you have, not labels, right? The idea of label correctness. So this idea of effort and how to measure it and how to filter out noisy data points. Also studying active learning methods and figuring out where they work exactly. Benchmarking on other data sets and using other methods. This is more broad into like making a framework into weekly supervised learning. And then also the ablation study that I mentioned, trying to assess standards used for training and how much they contribute and how much like they make other techniques obsolete in this case. And finally, although we weren't successful at the time using our simple hybridization methods, we want to dig deeper into that and like see what kind of hybrid methods or techniques would work when you have different scoring functions that work in certain regimes, and you want to combine them into one that kind of informs the sampling process all the way to 10,000 labels and more. Yeah, I think like this experience was really informative for our work, because many of our projects we are facing this limitation when it comes to labels, and knowing where to label is really beneficial in accelerating the impact and deliverables that we want in terms of time and resources. So looking at the other submissions, looking at our own contribution and subsequent winning of this competition was really beneficial in our work too. Yeah, that's it. Open for any questions. Back to you, Millicent.
Thank you very much, Akram. This is great work that you've done, you and Simone. I mean, it's very interesting. Yeah, we have one question from Felix, but I also had a question, especially where you are showing us. I don't know whether you can show us your slides again about internal scoring. I was wondering, because you mentioned the organization didn't provide you with the test set. So for your internal scoring, I wonder how you created your test set. Was it from your training data? But you had really nice scores there. Yeah.
I think Simone can answer this since she covered it, if she's here.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Millicent. Yeah. So what we had to do was, because we didn't have access to the organizer's test set, we had to create an internal test set which we wouldn't look at only when we're doing the downstream evaluation. So what that meant was, from the validations, we have a training set and a validation set. From the validation set, we actually split it to create an internal validation and an internal test. We split it into two. So that internal test is what we keep out and replicate the process that the organizers would take for obtaining leaderboard metrics with. And we don't use that when we're developing our for scoring functions or doing downstream training. Yeah.
I think I must have missed that. Thank you very much for answering. Okay, Felix is asking, could you explain a bit more on what it would entail to improve mask complexity or quality? Akram.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't get it. Let me switch to the
Yes, so
slide
Felix
about
is asking
complexity.
if you could explain a bit more on what it would entail to improve the mask complexity or quality. Or do you want maybe Felix?
To improve even more. So to give an overview, like you have this mask, you wanna assess how good it is, right? How complex it is. The idea being that the more it is complex, the more information would be provided to the model during learning, right? So looking at a label, let's say I give an example. You have labels here, right? These are the masks, the ones that have the colors, and we asked ourselves, what kind of scoring function would take one mask as an input and then give you a number? That would be the score. That the two ideas that we came up with, one has to do with the presence of as many classes as possible. So if you have a mask that actually has all 16 classes present within it at the same time, that would be perfect. And also present in an equal way, like balanced, that would give you the optimal entropy. So that's the first idea. How many classes, how many categories of objects are present within the mask? The second idea being how many edges exist. The reason being is that when you have an edge, you have some kind of friction, surface friction between the classes. And when you're doing the learning, that would give more information to the model. Ways to improve this. I think the one obvious way we thought of is like figuring out how much effort went into the label, meaning how much the label is correct. As an example of that being like, maybe you're gonna have a high complexity label, but maybe it's not even annotated enough. Maybe it's still suboptimal or not complete. In that case, we want to filter out the incorrect ones. So that's one obvious way to improve it even more, is to penalize the labels that are not correctly annotated. And the space is open. Like, I mean, you can start combining the label with the image, and for example, like take the pixels that correspond to one class from the label and calculate the features on its corresponding patch or image, and then see how much homogeneous these features are. Like, again, I think this is a way to assess how correct the label is. Yeah, and I think that's it. I mean, there are many algorithms that can be used for this that fall under like texture analysis, ways to like define edges and like just the complexity of a mask, how smooth, for example, the edges, what kind of shapes exist within the labels, and so on. I think one experiment that we ran that is related to this is that we took the labels and just the labels, and we ran them through a neural net, and we got representations of the labels. Then we clustered them, and what that gave us, similar to Venn, but then we are doing it here for labels, is that there are clusters that have labels that are similar to each other, although all of them are complex, but they are similar in texture. And there are clusters which are like, for example, are very simple, and that invites certain like selection bias and also not explicit focus on complexity for its sake, but having diversity, right? Introducing diversity into the complexity sampling. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but these are the things we tried.
Yeah, I think that answers the question. Yeah. Do we have any other question for Simone and Akram? Any question? Okay. Yeah, I think there are no more questions. I think we'll give you back your time, Simone, to go back to bed. And yeah, thanks for waking up early to do such a wonderful presentation. I mean, you guys have done such an amazing work. That was really great. Thank you very much for presenting it to us very, very wonderfully. And yeah, thanks again. And thank you everybody for joining. I'll keep you posted on our next talk next month. And thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
and have a
Thanks,
good
everyone.
evening.